Welcome to Ruminations. I'm your host, Bobby Gill, and today we are talking with Phyllis and Paul Van Amburgh, who run Dharma, a 100% grass-fed and holistically managed dairy farm in upstate New York. In this episode, we'll explore how they got started as first-generation farmers, how they transitioned from beef to dairy, then how they transitioned from conventional dairy to grass-fed, and then finally how they went from rotational grazing to holistic plan grazing. In doing so, the Van Amburghs increased their grazing season by 120%. They cut their feed costs by 20%. They improved their profit margins to 41% compared to just 3% in grain-fed dairy. We also go over their soil organic matter, which hovered around 2 to 3% when they first bought the farm, and now hovers between 11 and 13%. So incredible results that they're seeing out at Dharma. We'll break down what holistic plan grazing actually looks like in dairy, how they built this more resilient business model, what it's like raising a family on a working dairy farm, why more farmers aren't making the shift, and a lot more. But let's get to the bios. Paul and Phyllis began their farming journey in '98 with small-scale beef production. Today, they milk over 200 cows that are 100% grass-fed, and they do so with their 5 kids that range in age from 15 to 24. Phyllis is an accredited holistic management educator in the Savory Global Network, and so she's working with farmers across the world to help them transition their conventional practices to more regenerative operations. Paul Van Amburgh has played a key role in developing the market for 100% grass-fed dairy, including helping to establish Maple Hill Creamery, now one of the largest grass-fed dairy brands in the U.S. Paul and Phyllis have also played a key role in the development of the Northeast Organic Dairy Producers Alliance, and they've been active thought leaders and action leaders in promoting grass-fed dairy as a viable alternative to industrial production. And with that, I'll just say, let's dive in. It's a wonderful conversation. We go long on this one. It's about 2 hours, and I have pages and pages of questions that I didn't get to. So we will probably do a round 2 with Paul and Phyllis at some point. But for now, here is my conversation with Paul and Phyllis Van Amburgh of Dharma. But first, a word from our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by Savory's growing community of regenerating members, listeners like you who care about real solutions for our global grasslands. Over the past decade, the Savory Institute has helped restore more than 100 million acres through holistic plan grazing, creating productive and resilient landscapes where fertile soils lead to healthy food and thriving communities. But this kind of impact is only possible with support from people like you. For just $10 a month, less than the cost of lunch, your support can help restore nearly 400 acres of land every single year. And as a regenerating member, you'll join our global community of over 600 like-minded people committed to making real change where it matters the most. You'll get access to Savory's private online network, a free holistic management online course, discounts from partner brands, and even opportunities to connect with Alan Savory. Signing up is fast, easy, and it makes a real impact. Just visit savory.global/member, that's savory.global/MEMBER, and start making an impact today. Have you seen Alan Savory's TED Talk? There's a set of before and after photos in that TED Talk that show the transformation that's possible. And this particular set of photos are in Zimbabwe. It's totally barren land, and then just 3 or 4 years later, after managing holistically, the grasses are tall, head-high perennials. It's an incredible transformation, and there's a chance that you can go see this in person. We've got an upcoming Savory journey to go visit this site. This is the Dimbangombe Conservancy. It's in Victoria Falls, Zimbabwe. It's Alan Savory's home. It's the birthplace of holistic management. It's the first ever Savory hub. We're running a trip in January of 2026. We're going to have a group of about 6 to 12 people going, and we've teamed up with the Africa Center for Holistic Management, and we're giving away one of these slots on the trip for free. If you want to get in on this, we've got a giveaway happening in celebration of Earth Day. There's 3 different ways to enter. Basically, you can donate to the Savory Institute, support our global mission regenerating grasslands, or you can support the local efforts that are happening at the Africa Center for Holistic Management over there at Dimbangombe. The choice is yours. There's 3 ways to enter, 3 entries maximum per person. One lucky winner will be drawn to win this trip, which is valued at $4,300. Entries are open now. Get your entries in between now and May 15th when the contest closes, and then we'll select the winner. Airfare is not included. Terms and conditions apply. All the details are available on the website, which is savory.global/Earth Day giveaway. That is savory.global/Earth-Day-giveaway. We'll also link it here below the episode. We'll see you in Zim. Paul, Phyllis Van Amburgh, welcome to the Ruminations.
Good morning. Thanks for having us.
It's so great to see you guys. It's been a few years. How's life on the farm these days?
Pretty good. We love it, honestly. Challenges as always. It's winter, so not a good time to ask that question, but
But winter is when you rest, right?
right.
Yeah, theoretically. Yeah.
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 I guess
Yeah,
there's not as much rest in a dairy operation in the winter as you would with beef.
Not at all.
no, I mean, single digits creates its own set of issues, and water and cow comfort and diesel fuel, lots of things that have to your process becomes very important. So, oh, I forgot to plug in the skid loader. Well, then we're going to wait 4 hours to start chores. So everything is processed in the winter, and it's been an interesting winter because our typically I'm running that process, and this is the sort of the first winter that I'm not running that process. My children are running the process, and so um, it's been really amazing to watch them sort of move into that role a lot more gracefully, frankly, than their father does it.
Yeah. What has that transition been like? Tell us a little bit about the family, your kids' ages, and it sounds like now they're getting involved in the family business. What's that like?
What are the ages, Philly? I always mess them, so I'll let you do that.
And I'll just throw in for context that we started dairying with 3 small children. We had 5, so we were in the beginning. Our beginning dairy years were also little babies and little kids, and now they're all grown, and so they're 24, 23, 19, 17, and 15. And it's been a great ride. And kids, you always hope that they're going to grow up and turn into amazing people. And um, your job as a parent is to try to set that up. And watching them um, really grow into just the best people and having them still around is, I mean, I feel like we've arrived just on that point, regardless of whatever else we've done. So Grace is the oldest. She's 24. She was married last summer, and we bought a new farm 8 years ago because all 5 kids wanted to still be involved in the farm from what they thought at the age. We took a gamble. Um, so she's running our smaller farm, and the other 4 are involved also. It's not really too different. It's sort of just 2 locations of the same farm. Um, and yeah, so Vince is 23, and he probably does the majority of the management on the farm.
Yeah.
Um, he's in charge of a lot, but Oliver, who's 17, is right behind him. So we talked about winter, and the other thing that came to my mind was, every other day we got to make sure the driveway is clear and de-iced so that the milk truck can come up and come in. And we always have mechanical. Our milk system is always running. We're always collecting milk, cooling milk, all that stuff. So they have a big role in sort of doing that, taking care of the cows. Ruby, who's 15, has been tremendously more involved this year. So she actually, the other 2 daughters, Maggie and Grace, are very cow focused, and Ruby is sort of cow and I would say machinery focused.
Yes.
So she runs the skid steer and keeps the barn clean. Um, keeps the holding area clean, et cetera, et cetera. But she's also in charge of calves. She and Maggie together, which is no small task, especially this time of year. We've had, I don't know, I think 7 already in the last 4 days, 7 calves. Yeah,
Yeah,
they're amazing.
It's kind of wild to watch um, them explore their own independence around a lot of these things, Bobby. I mean, in a sense,
Mm.
it's um, I mean, nothing like a kid to show you your own inadequacies in a certain respect. Like
Mm-hmm.
you start like you know probably most of the questions that are coming out of my mouth, I'm stopping before I ask them because it's really questions that I probably should have asked myself a long time ago. So this is, you asked what it's like. It's like probably one of the most humbling things that I've ever been through, and at the same time, it doesn't shift my personality, who I am, which is almost entirely type A, which is what drives a farmer is they get out of bed and they do things right or wrong all day long. That's who they are, not necessarily because it's all well thought through. And when you see that in your kids, it's just this like, wow, oh my gosh. So that's what it's been like for me is a period of self reflection in a certain respect, and also realizing that I did some things, we did some things as a couple right because we put them in a place where they're starting with a lot more confidence in most cases than we did, and we talk about those early years prior, like we understood holistic management, but we hadn't fully integrated it to the farm yet. So, that lack of confidence in your decisions, that's a real thing, on the
Mhm.
farm. And our kids are matter of fact about so much. It's like, wow. And, so it's just awesome from that standpoint,
Yeah.
actually.
I can only imagine how much pride you must have with all of your kids wanting to still be involved in the family business and not having that pull to a more urban life that you see in so many rural locations all around the world. And so I guess I'm wondering, is that by design? Like, did you set out when you started farming and started raising your kids at the farm? Was that part of your context that you wanted this to be a family business, or did this kind of happen organically?
No, I mean, there was a lot of intention around that. And in fact, they're all homeschooled, right? So that was a key part of it in the sense that, and um, you know, homeschooling 30 years ago is different. Like homeschooling is supported now, but 30 years ago, when we were talking about doing that, there was a lot of pushback. But what we had in our brain is that they could probably get a decent education in the school system, but the cultural things that we felt strongly about would be lost in that conversation. And I think our intuition around that was probably pretty good. And so um, I joke about it now and I say, oh, yeah, I mean, they're brainwashed, but I did the brainwashing. I mean, so, and what do we mean by that? Well, we had a very specific set of rules with our kids, and it was all sort of moving towards this day. And a lot of it came out of Phyllis's family sort of ideology, and then my family's ideology. And I always talk about my grandmother who had an influence on the family business I grew up in, and loyalty. There was a very, very high value placed on loyalty and interaction in a way that was not insulting. Now, she was a tough Irish Catholic person, and insulting other people was fine, but you didn't do that. And we moved that forward. Like these five, um, while they can be spicy with each other a little bit, they're very supportive of each other, and they know that that's a big part of the job. So of keeping the farm working, keeping the family working, and so yeah, grace, forgiveness, all of those things have to play a part in that. And I would say also the piece I think that I think gets downplayed a lot. They hold each other to a very high standard, and that's not always fair, and it doesn't have to be. I they push each other to excel and be the best that they can be at things, and when they mess up or don't hold that they're part of the bargain up, they push back on each other. It takes Phyllis and I out of that job because parents um, are hurt a certain way, and then siblings are hurt a different way. Like parents can wound a child's soul quite easily. So that interaction has to be somewhat different. But the siblings, they're tough on each other, and they
but
just
in a very loving way,
exactly they just kind
really.
of roll with it with
Yeah.
each other. Where and I've had to learn that lesson too. It's just you know I've said to Phyllis, parenting is actually quite simple because 99 out of 100 times the right answer is shut your mouth. Just watch.
Hmm. Yeah.
And
And that's the same with a family business.
for me, it was intentional from the start. And you know, one of the things, so I started out as an occupational therapist working with preschool kids, and so kids were always, in development. That was always kind of on my mind anyway. Um, and there were three things that I would say contributed to the ethos. One was there were all kinds of views around me about around parenting and parenthood, and it seemed like there was this universal: kids are great until they turn 5. Kids are great until they turn 5, and it didn't matter, boys, girls, older parents, younger parents. And I'm like, that's pretty universal. Like, what is it? Because kids develop at different stages and ages. There's a lot, especially at that age. There's a lot of wiggle room. The only universal is that that's when they go to school, and that's when
Mm.
their parenting gets interrupted, and that's when their relationship with their kids gets interrupted. And the other thing was the parents of older kids, kids, they just don't have the responsibility, don't have the responsibility. And I did a lot of noodling about that because it wasn't that people weren't trying to give their kids responsibility. What it came down to for me was that you can't give someone responsibility. They either take responsibility or they don't. And
Hmm.
the farm was a way for them to have a meaningful place from the start that allowed them to take true responsibility, not responsibility that didn't really have any consequences. Because sure, you get kids that will take responsibility in a what I'll say is a more structured from the outside existence, right? You got to do your homework. You got to show up to practice on time. You have to do all those things. And they will take that responsibility and they will learn responsibility, but they don't have to. If they don't do their homework, they might get yelled at. Big deal. If they don't show up for practice on time, they're probably not going to get kicked off the team. And even if they do, they're still, those consequences are pretty wimp. You know, on a farm, you're responsible for, you know, letting us know how the calving is going, and you don't, and something dies. That's that's actually kind of real. And you know, now they're not afraid of responsibility. They are they're on it. They're like, "Nope, I got it. I'm out there." And Oliver's 17 years old and he is making sure that that truck can get up and collect that milk. He's up in the morning with that on his mind, and we don't have to do anything about it anymore. It started out, which you wonder as you're navigating all that. And now you have little kids and they're 9, and you're like, look, this is this situation is depending on you, and it's a delicate balance. And I won't say it was easy.
Hmm.
How much do you give them so that they don't hate it? how much do you give them so that they find it rewarding? But it can't be meaningless or it's not rewarding. It's kind of a paradox.
It's a balance.
It's a
Yeah.
balance. And the third thing was, we were doing some other things when they were little, like, always talk about the fact that Grace had like a 1 hour dance class when she was little. And it occurred to me that that was taking from like Friday to Sunday by the time we geared up and made sure that she had her, her leotard and get ready and pack the snacks for the other, and I was like, oh, okay, so there it is. You have your kids and they're going to school. They're coming home at night, but their head is still at school.
Yeah,
So
just to sort of explain that more fully, Bobby, what we learned very quickly that we weren't going to do all of those extracurricular activities. Like if we tried to pull that off and do everything as some parents do, and I give them a lot of credit for trying, but we tried to do a few like things off the farm, and with 5 kids, we like it. This was very obvious. This was not going to work to us, like right away.
I could only imagine. I mean, you've got cows that need to be milked twice a day, and you've got a business that needs to be run, let alone adding in soccer practices and recitals and, like all the other things that people seem to overload their kids' schedules with.
Yes.
So we
Yeah.
tried to make this as meaningful and fulfilling as we could.
And fun.
And fun.
Yeah.
And with always the idea that this was also a trick to be able to let them know you're not locked in, honestly, right? We're not like, we're a dairy farming family. You're going to dairy farm. Your kids are going to dairy. No, we did not do that either.
Whether it's a dairy farm, whether it's agritourism, whether you decide to build houses on it, whatever your set of, we're giving you a set of resources and you're going to need to decide what your life's going to look like. And that's what, that was
Yes.
actually a big part of our message. And that one took a long time for them to understand.
Yeah. So like you're not prescribing specific actions that they need to take in life. Rather, you're saying this is the context that drives our family. This is our North Star that guides us in all that we do. And you're a valuable component of that. Make decisions accordingly because we're all in this boat together. And I think this is where, what you were saying, means of production were removed from the holistic management framework with the third edition of the book, because the means of production aren't really relevant. Those can change. What matters is the context, that bearing that you're on, and that you stay in line with that bearing, because that's the quality of life and the future resource base that you're trying to, bring everyone along with.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that along with other things, I mean, we are thankful for an understanding of this process all the time because, as Paul said, he's watching our kids do things so much more gracefully. And those fundamental concepts, understand, that set of understanding that you gain, if you bring those in constantly at the ground level with your kids, and you remember to go back to those in that sense, which is reminding them, look, yes, I know, you don't have to decide if you want to be a dairy farmer, right? You're learning these skills and they fold back to this underlying set of activities and resources and whatever, but really a way of moving through the world that now you can swap out that mode of production anywhere.
Yeah. And I would, this might be somewhat of a sort of a weird take on it, but I grew up around my father, my uncle, my grandfathers. And the way I talk about those people is that they were able to do anything. Like these guys could do anything. I mean, and my grandmother too. I mean, like they could, we got to fix the plumbing. We got to do some plumbing. We got to do some electric. We got to do some carpentry. We got to do some farming. We got to fix the machine. That kind of universal take on things too has been part of what I've tried to convince my kids, like, and also well-read, never stop learning. And then, the last couple of years has been a lot of financial and business literacy
Mm.
Like, um,
That's
you know,
amazing because that's not usually taught to kids or young adults. It's something that you hear so
exactly.
often. I didn't learn about money from my parents, and now here I am later in life, and I don't know what I'm doing. And I wish I would have learned this, decades ago, because that's ultimately the trick to a lot of these things is getting started early.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I mean, I don't, I would say, like, to a lot of parents, just read the room, man. Like, look what's going on.
Yeah.
And we've got a lot of people who are in their fifth and sixth decade, and they still are making financial decisions that are really contrary to their best interest. And it's like, I just wanted my kids to have that ease of their knowledge around money, so that it didn't have to be an overwhelming stressor in their life, which is really the shame that I see for most people. Like, they're always worried about money, and I see how destructive it is in their life, and I wish that they would make different decisions around it, so that they didn't have to be stressed about it so much, really, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And so, I wanted that for my kids. I wanted that ease around money. Um, and that's not that I wanted them necessarily to be rich. But I wanted them to have enough of a understanding so that they were managing the financial resources in their life in a way that created some amount of grace.
Yeah, to
And
take them out of that victim mentality and instead
yes,
put them in charge where, "Hey, I'm a decision maker here. I choose my fate on which path
e-
I'm going down."
exactly, exactly.
So I think we'll get into the financial aspects of your operation. I know there was some really interesting pieces in a case study that you put out with 3LM, where you look at your gross margin compared to like typical grain fed. But before we get into all that nuance of your operation and dairy, maybe set the stage for folks. Let's rewind a little bit and go back to, how did you guys get into farming? Like, what's your backstory, and how did you end up where you are today?
All the way back.
I mean, as far back as you wanna go. Phyllis, you already mentioned that you used to be in occupational therapy, and so, maybe let's start
Yeah,
somewhere around there.
it really did start there, with my work as an OT and seeing working with kids with developmental delays and looking at all kinds of things with all these, precious little kids that were coming in, and one is a twin, an identical twin who's got some delays that their identical twin doesn't. So you start to say, okay, well, what's going on? Um, with environmental factors and epigenetics, right? And then you read about twins that are separated, for example, or you just have a kid that has, strange, no red food, which isn't actually strange because we know that, but really bad day if they do. So extreme reactions, things like that. And so started to really question all of the things that contribute to people's lives outside of their basic genetics that affect your quality of life, really. um, and meeting Paul and us deciding, well, we're going to grow as much of our food as we can, so we get a couple dairy goats and some chickens to lay eggs, and then we raise some pigs, and I got a couple draft horses because I'm a, just love them. And we're meeting people we're going to the fair for the week, as on the exhibit, and meeting all kinds of other people that are growing their food and homesteading and things like that. And just really kind of getting back toward, you know, an existence that takes a little bit more control over your own destiny that way, especially, I guess, around food. Um, and, he was sort of on the corporate beat, which was really affecting his health. Um, and, here I am naive. I'm what, 25? And I'm like, well, then you should quit your job if it makes you sick. He's like, what? But he did. And so we decided to start raising, he went back to sort of a bigger love in his life, which is he's an amazing carpenter, and he started doing work for people, renovating their dream homes in a sense, and was very, very good at it because he loved it, and he's super smart. Um, and we were married, and I stayed home with the first two babies. And as we, then we said, okay, well, what about raw milk? What about a family cow? What about raising a couple of beef cows? And it just started to just get bigger and bigger. And then we naively thought, well, if we get some dairy cows, we might be able to run enough cash through this thing.
Yeah, there was another piece there, and that's, Bobby, I having grown up in a family business, and in those days they didn't like work life balance was would have, like, if I had that conversation with my uncles and grandparents, we would have laughed ourselves out of the room. Like, what are you talking about? We don't talk about that. You work till you literally can't work anymore. And they were very, very ambitious people because to a generation, my grandmother, frankly, her mother died at 17 in childbirth of my grandmother. Like, they were Irish immigrants. Like, it was heavily imprinted on my family that ambition is what keeps you out of trouble. And so you don't find excuses for not getting things done. So I have a work ethic that needs like management almost in a sense. And I was leaving at 5 in the morning, getting home at 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. And with the first two were already alive, Vincent and Grace. And I never saw them because I worked a minimum of 6 days a week. And
And we had a small beef herd and
right,
and hogs, and so I was at home.
right. And so
Raising
I would
two kids and all the animals, and Paul's out at work. Oh my God.
my grandparents make this mistake, and I'm not going to make it. We're gonna figure. I'm going to apply this insane work ethic to something right here, right next to our kids, right on top of what we're trying to provide for. So that was why farming commercially became like this option, because for me, because I just said, well, what if we could do this? In fact, we talk about this a lot. What if we could just break even? What if we could break even?
Mhm.
What if we could make enough money to support this very modest lifestyle together?
And keep me happy because we were together all day.
Exactly. And so that was one of the original, I mean, you want to talk about a context, right? So this was sort of born out of reality. And at that point, I was spending 5 hours a day in the truck, and that's why I would leave and come home so late because um, I was in a second home market, and that was a long way from ag land. I was in the wealthy New Yorkers spilling into the Hudson Valley. That's where I was doing a lot of work, and
Mhm.
and that was 2 hours and 20 minutes from where we lived. So yeah, that's what we were doing when we got our start, and then then the reality of, I mean, sort of the numbers on dairy farming became more.
Well, there was a distressed dairy that was an opportunity for us, and
Yes.
we purchased that, and we were on our way. And um, knowing what we know now, we wouldn't have kept the cows because they were also distressed.
Mhm.
Uh, they were pretty far gone. 70% of them had mastitis that really compromised our milk market, for example. And the cull rate was very high, and the average age was 7 years, which I don't know if you know anything about dairy, but that's like way past retirement age for dairy cows. There were no young cows, there were no bred heifers, no yearlings, and no calves. So
Mm.
you those folks that are listening that have any experience in dairy would go, "What were you thinking?" Well, we weren't because we didn't have experience in dairy, but you can't start out with startup costs and not have any succession, any bench in your cows.
Mhm.
It's just, especially in organic dairy, because it's just really. But
I mean, we
anyway,
say that, but
we learned a
frankly,
lot.
yeah, what it did is it forced us to learn so much so quickly, and that has served us incredibly well. And our
Mhm.
kids also um, sort of. Grace especially saw us work through those early cow health, feet problems, and fertility issues and all of those things. And, a lot of our mentors, Jerry Brunetti, Gerald Fry, um, and really Buck Chastain, people that are gone now, um, by having long phone conversations, having them to our farm when they so gracious with their time, getting a chance to travel with Gerald. Um, and I mean, these were we got to learn from these people, which was a huge gift. And I'm very like, I don't take no for an answer, either does Phyllis. So we would, I know you don't have time for this conversation, but can you walk me through this? Like, what do I need to understand here about soil health? And I remember a certain conversation about our soils and the cattle and with Jerry Brunetti, and we got engaged, and it was 4.5 hours later that I hung up the phone, and I had been scribbling down notes the entire conversation. I still have those notes, by the way. And so, we didn't know that you didn't like call up the high powered consultant and not ask them for answers. We just did it. And we didn't have any money either, so we had no like, we can't pay for this, but will you help us? And thankfully, all these people were very gracious with their time. And obviously, Alan is that same way. I mean, he helped us understand so much. And honestly, I always say there was, if we didn't have those mentors, and if we didn't meet Laura and Tim Joseph and sort of been on that ground floor of Maple Hill as a market, and we didn't fully engage and learn holistic management, we would not be farming today. I mean, it's just that simple. You can't. There's so many. It's not for me. It was not learning. It was unlearning, is what kept me alive, because I thought I knew so much about businesses and the way they essentially operate, and I did.
You did.
I had a lot of experience in that, but it wasn't as applicable to this as I thought, and and I was constantly sort of driving off that cliff in a sense, because I was taking a very linear approach to it, exactly, and so yeah, I mean, I don't know if that explanation really makes sense to you, but
you have a luxury of being linear in other businesses, to be frank.
Yes.
And you don't in agriculture.
Can you speak more to that unlearning of, everything that you unlearned coming from traditional business? What were some of the things that you had to unlearn, and what did that transition to?
I have one.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. I have one too.
The idea of a deadline. And once you're in agriculture, you understand why it's a deadline. Before that, it's meaningless.
Well, so yeah. I mean, for me, it was the please don't take this as an oversimplification of the rest of the business world, because that's not what I mean by this. But in a lot of the time in dollar in, dollar out, like capital investment, capex in the business, and you got your Excel file, you've got your next 3 years projected. It all makes it makes a lot of sense, right? But a spreadsheet doesn't have fertility and biology and a lot of the things that are necessary to understand in the spreadsheet, right? So I was doing things, spending hard-earned dollars and frankly money that we had from I call it our other life, on trying to get the fertility of the farm started, and in 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 ways that were not productive, because I didn't understand, frankly, the four ecosystem processes. I didn't understand that I had a resource conversion issue. Um, and and so, you know, once I sort of got inside of those things, our dollars were a lot more were applied in a much more profound manner. And you know, that's that's the thing about, I've watched very, very wealthy people go broke farming. And that is because they do not learn that piece. They do not get to the point where they're beginning to understand that they're, in fact, I've said to people, there is no amount of wealth that farming can't remove you from if you don't learn holistic management.
Yeah.
True.
What I'm thinking is that, you have a finite amount of resources in front of you, but then you have an infinite number of possibilities ahead of you in terms of things you could do or get distracted by or paths you could go down. And if you're not careful, you're going to expend that finite amount of resources, whether that's time or money or forage. You're
Yeah.
going to spend those resources perhaps chasing the wrong things if you don't have that clarity of where you're going and why.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, the whole idea that everything brings you to supporting and expanding, enhancing your future ability to keep doing what you love and want around you, that future resource base. That's
Mhm.
really like, that brings it all home because, you can, I call it a throughput model, right? And dairy is classic. They've managed to turn a sector of agriculture into a very linear business like model in a sense, right? You need to be a good buyer. And they can't escape it 100%, but still, you're always pushing towards, well, I'll find a better quality corn. I'll find, a more efficient milk system. You're a better purchaser. You're making those Excel line items more efficient. But all you're
Well,
doing
no,
is pushing it
yeah,
off to somebody else.
yeah, and I would say in dairy, it really it came down to this for me is it's the answer almost always on dairy farms is milking more cows.
Yeah, no matter the problem,
No
milk more
matter the
cows.
problem, the answer is always no. Well, how many you milking? 200. You probably ought to go to 250. You probably ought to go 300. And now, of course, these guys are, well, you're at 6,000. You probably ought to go to 10. You know,
And
you're gonna have to borrow more money.
it makes perfect sense when you look at the linear financial business model, which is always the expansion of debt, always trying to skim a smaller margin off a larger amount of cash throughput. So it really doesn't matter. The answer is always more cows. The problem is that there is no end to that mechanism being really your only tool. And grass-fed dairy just, it cuts that right off at the knees. I mean, you are now actually in control of your own resource base. And those other larger dairies, yes, I know but it doesn't even have to be larger dairies. But as soon as a large amount of what you're bringing through your dairy is able to be pushed off to somebody else, you know, you 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 move closer towards that linear model, and you get more dangerously, down that road. Grass-fed dairy, your grass is right here. Your cows have to go get it, and every other day you see the result of that in your paycheck. You know,
Mhm. Can
um,
can you speak to some of those aspects of the gross margin, the differences between, your typical grain-fed conventional dairy and then grass-fed, and honestly grass-fed holistically managed? Because as we know, there's grass-fed done properly, and then there can be grass-fed done poorly. Not all grass-fed operations are made the same. I know you guys have gone through those transitions, starting from a more conventional dairy approach, feeding organic grain, to becoming 100% grass-fed, but then kind of honing in on your land management, going from a more traditional rotational grazing to holistic planned grazing. So there's been some transitions, and in doing so, your margins have changed significantly. So can you speak to, I mean, maybe what some of those changes were, and the decisions you've made along the way, and that how that helps your profitability?
Sure. So, we talk about in our world is kind of these pillars that we depend on, that sort of build our production model. And um, so, grass management, being able to graze in a way that keeps us from feeding high quality or high value feed for as many days a year as possible, right? So, and when I say that, I mean I'm sort of directing that towards the absolute understanding of the resource that you're managing, and then the planning of the grazing, right? So, um, prior to doing that, uh, pasture, though we believed it was central to our approach, it was always being managed and therefore productive in a way that was underwhelming as far as the impact on our finances. And we, because we teach a lot of this now, we've got slides that sort of show even a small change, which is a week or 2 or 3 extension in your grazing system, has profound impact on, for a small berry, $500 a day. Well, 3 weeks, that now you're approaching a margin in dairy, So, um, yeah, and then the I would say another big understanding for us was the right kind of cow to go and do that. And so, dairy is so fraught with single trait selection. In other words, cows are just selected for milk production, and um, they can look like almost anything, be any color, be any breed, etc. But if they're a heavy producer, they sort of end up being part of the selection process, and the bulls that come from those kind of cows, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that we came to very quickly was that selling more milk was not going to necessarily make this work better. Um, it had to be measured on a per acre basis. And maybe we shouldn't be looking at just fluid milk. Maybe we should be looking at pounds of fat produced, sort of energy corrected milk, if you will. Looking at it, in other words, pounds a cow, acres that we're grazing, optimizing rather than maximizing milk production. And that is such a brain breaker because everything in dairy, like, is more milk. Like every conversation. And when you and of course we came into this without the dairy experience. So we were always struck by like how every conversation was, how do we make more milk? When, you know, I had a very good friend who milked 25 cows. And when the organic milk price dropped, Bobby, he stopped. He went to 15 cows. And this guy had been at this a very, very long time. And I said to him, I said, why would you do that, Corey? Like, what are you doing? He said, well, if I'm losing a little bit of money on each cow poll, what do I want to milk more of them for? And I went, oh, it was such a, and so, I mean, I kind of carried that forward into our approach, which was, okay, the right cow, the right pasture management. And then honestly, in the last few years, it's been sort of vigorously understanding the finances of what we're doing and from a depreciation standpoint, and also um, understanding the entirety of high quality feed. In other words, so much of grass fed, if you so much of the feed making aspects of it, and people have trouble with this because they the first question we get a lot of the time is, why don't you just pasture them all the time? And I mean, we started the conversation there. I mean, we're under 1.5 foot of snow with ice underneath it, and it's 5 degrees right now. So we have to feed high quality feed to make milk in the winter. and understanding how to do that from a resources applied standpoint. So, we can teach somebody through a forage test now, and we do look at all of those things, and those, you're not saying goodbye to that world because you understand holistic management. You know, it's not holistic management is not an invitation to not fully understand the technical aspects of the farming you're doing. And I think that's a thing that I've seen in some early uh, farmers' early adoption of holistic management. They think it gets them out of some of these other jobs, but what it actually does is that it teaches you the importance of those technical things and how to apply them to the farm in a way that's more intelligent, other than how is this going to um, uh, they don't. It's no longer a standalone problem. It's actually built into the part of the context, and you understand exactly what it's doing for you. It's the, I mean, Phyllis would say it's the weak link. It's understanding your weak link, and then applying it back to the your overall approach to the farm.
And I when you said, what do I want to milk more cows for? Most dairy farmers have to milk more cows because their their linear cash flow depends on it,
Right.
right? And, you know, Corey, I call him a closet holistic manager. I mean, there's people that are like, that they kind of get holistic management, but they don't really, you know, they haven't really delved into it to really fully try it on, which for me was phenomenal because, and it took years to really, still there's more. I'm learning about it all the time, but it even took a couple of years for me, I think, in retrospect, to fully wrap my brain around a lot of it. Um, but what it allowed me to do was look back at all of the things that had worked and understand why they had worked, and look at the things that hadn't worked and understand why they hadn't worked. And the idea that I mean, it really does. You don't get yourself out of any of those tools. You just wield them better, right? All tools are on the table. I love that one.
Hmm.
You just have more tools and you use them more appropriately. And you don't you don't get lulled into thinking that paper dollars are actually a resource, right? The sources and uses. You got to go right through that idea. And what are you using it for and where did it come from is so important because it completely changes financial management to include all of the things that it should, instead of just being able to balance your checkbook or make your Excel numbers work, you know. And we just had this was really interesting for me because we just had a neighbor, and we tried where anyway, he was looking at trying to improve a newly purchased farm with grazing some steers. And he said, I don't really see how this is working out. And he showed us all of his numbers with to feed, labor, et cetera. And he had a little bit of a loss on each steer at the end of this
Yeah, it was
this
like
Excel sheet.
$70 an animal at the end of the season.
And, he said, I don't see it. And this was not somebody from agriculture. This is somebody helping his friend out. And we said, well, when we had met with them 3 times, right? We're trying to get them through this. And the first thing we said is, you got to let us know what you're in this for. You've got to tell us your context. And in a he said, well, we want to really improve this farm, and we want it to be more productive, and we want to be regenerative, and he had all the buzzwords, and we were like,
Hmm.
right, that's awesome. Um, and then fast forward, and we said, okay, where in your number is the regenerate is this soil health that you're getting from grazing these cattle? Because for us, we look at, we've got a hoop barn, for example, of open pack housing for our cows, and we spend a bunch of money on straw and bedding and things like that, and tilling it, composting it, and 3 times a year we have unbelievable fertilizer that comes out of that pack. So how much does it cost to run the pack? What's the value of that fertilizer? You have to put that,
Hmm.
and you can translate everything into these, more familiar financial tools if you want to. But honestly, it seems like the room is endless at a certain point because there are so many co-benefits to things that you do. And I think that really is some of what is in that difference in financial viability with just following that prescriptive look, buy a cow, you've got so many stalls, try to produce as much milk as you can from that spot, and that'll give you the biggest gross income, right? Do I have that right? And try to minimize your costs, and that's really it. To okay, wait a minute, but when we do a good job grazing and we improve that actual soil health, we get an ability to first of all produce milk without having to bring them feed. When we have an ability to take high quality, highly digestible feed from land that's actually healthy, how come we feed um, you know, 3 bales for every 5 of the stuff that comes off of poor ground? Plus the cows are healthier and they milk better. So you've got that for us, the cows are a product conversion, right?
Mhm.
So how well is your herd of cows produced, taking your forages and or grain? Because I firmly believe it doesn't matter whether you're
Right.
grass-fed, organic, conventional. Holistic management will revolutionize your world if you understand it, right? So quality of the grain is low. That's kind of a no-brainer, but it's kind of bigger than that because you start to see how it impacts different portions of your you know that that
Mhm.
chain of that financial chain.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I say to new grass-fed guys is that you're going to earn the right to profitability, and that's through the understanding of these things we're discussing, Bobby, and then my application of them. So as the fertility of the farm grows through good management, pasture and or your cropland
And your cows.
and your cows, and you get a better, more manageable group with not outliers that you're choosing based on production only. Um, as that becomes more cohesive, the margin goes from basically nothing to very high performing grass fed farms are over net 30% now. We have a group of mature farms that are netting over 30%, which is pretty unheard of in
Yeah.
agriculture.
And the standard in, say, organic dairy is what, like 3%? Is that right?
Probably, I would
Maybe
say,
5,
yeah, maybe five. I mean,
maybe less.
Yeah.
it's
It's in the small single digits versus the 30% that you're seeing in your co-op.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I would say they're in a worse place almost. The organic guys now, because of the cost of the grain, are probably in a tougher spot than conventional farms of equal size. But
Mhm.
conventional farms actually have a higher margin because they have they're able their grain is cheaper, it's higher quality, and they're able to drive production with it. Milk, I mean, grain makes milk. There's no,
Mhm.
but and I don't make any moral or ethical judgments around that stuff. I work with dairy farmers every day, and they're all good people trying to figure it out.
Yep. Walk us through the transition from feeding grain, whether it's conventional or organic, to moving into 100% grass fed. My understanding is there's somewhat of a yield drag for the first couple years in terms
Sure.
of production per cow. But what does that transition look like for someone that's moving to 100% grass fed dairy?
Well, the first issue is that you're dealing your herd. Their rumens were developed on grain. So you've got an epigenetic impact on the rumen. I always tell startups that you're not going to be actually grass fed till you're milking a group of cows who have rumens that were developed on milk and grasses. And so there's a lot of human health information in regards to what grain does to our digestive system, and I would say it's probably more profound for cattle in the sense that these are sort of in many cases processed. very industrial approach. And
there's a lot of science around that too.
There's a ton of science around it. Rumen health, and so understanding, understanding that piece, which is until you have your grass-fed herd, if you will, you're going to be in a transitional phase. So, what we try to do is encourage these farmers to stop feeding their calves grain right away. And then the new calves that are born, don't feed them grain at all. Give them more milk, the natural
More milk for
concentrate.
longer.
More milk for longer, the natural concentrate that you control on the farm. That's your milk till you put it in the bulk tank. So put more of it into those calves, get them through puberty on milk and high quality grass, not any old hay bale, really well made baleage and high quality dry hay.
Make it your business to understand forages.
Right.
You'd be amazed how many people really don't understand forages and their role in nutrition.
Yep. And then get that that herd developed that way. The second piece is most organic guys or in conventional guys, they're looking at a percentage of total dry matter from pasture that's quite low. So in order to move to grass-fed, which is the OPT standard, requires 60% dry matter during the pasture season.
150 days.
150 days, right? So learning how to manage pasture so that can happen is a key part of that transition. And then I would say from there, the deeper aspects sort of come into play, and but if they get those two pieces
and learn how to graze.
Well, that's what I'm saying. They got to learn how to graze, and they got to learn that they're going to create their own herd.
Right.
And so I mean, that's what all of the education that we do with grass-fed guys sort of works around is those main pillars, and then we drive deep and try to get them to take on the lifelong learning that, frankly, because I say this all the time, grass-fed dairy is, we've made it. We're round in first base. We're probably going to slide into second here shortly.
As a group,
dairy. Right? But we got a long way to go, and a lot of it is in soil health, understanding how to better manage the resources, and I think market adoption is coming way quicker than the farmers are able to keep up with. So that, like, if you look forward the next 30 years, grass-fed milk, I said in 2010 that grass-fed milk will eventually be the milk that people drink, and we are going there. And so the opportunity is huge, and for new farming and startup farms, because the consumer is supporting this. I mean, we're getting mid-40 pay prices and as high as low 50s from many markets. There's a lot of opportunity out there, but you can where it sits. We have to really support our startups, because it's those first 5 years that are you're vulnerable, because if you don't sort of learn many of the things that we're touching on here, and you just apply sort of basic dairy knowledge, you can run yourself ragged and run right off a cliff, because the answer is not in more milk, it's in profitable milk. And so getting people to think about those fertility issues is super important, and we see it so much now in so much of the regenerative information. But a lot of that is all sizzle, no steak, right? You got to take it to the farm and get people to dry. Like, what does this mean? Well, what it means is we're in our shoulder seasons, we're going to bale graze any low fertility part of the pasture system that you're controlling those resources in. But does that mean I have to take the bales out there? Does that mean I have to, I mean,
It's
And
going to come up in wheat, all the
right, we worked through all those things, and we did them out of sheer grit, and frankly stupidity. I mean, we didn't know what we were doing, and we had to deal with a lot of the embarrassment of being laughed at, all that stuff. But now we have a pasture system that runs between 11 and 13% organic matter, and when you get to that, you can be a bad grazer, and there's more grass coming. It's just coming. There's no stopping it.
Do you know what your organic matter was when you bought the farm?
Probably two to
between
four,
2 to 4%.
And now it's, you said 11?
11 to 13.
Yep.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
No, you said there, walk us through, because there's a yield drag. And I love, Tim Joseph used to say the biggest hurdle to transitioning to grass fed is right here between the ears. And
Mhm.
it really is that understanding of, yes, a per cow dip having, even more than having maybe dip in production. There's the understanding around the implications of that and all of the things that contribute to that and are a consequence of that, which is most of the time you need a much smaller cow. Big cows on grass-fed rations, their maintenance requirements are too high. They physically can't take in, and if your soil health and your forage quality and digestibility isn't up there, they're taking in as much forage as they possibly can. There's not enough energy in there to meet their maintenance requirements, and
Right.
certainly isn't enough to push them into a milk. So you're changing cow size, right? You're changing the epigenetics of the rumen. You're changing your soil fertility. And those are the true economics of making profitable milk rather than milk volume, and getting them to switch their brain around, do whatever it takes as cheaply as possible to get a high volume per cow into that tank, into thinking about all of these other things that contribute to their profitability,
Yes.
which is, pounds of milk per pound of body weight, pounds of milk per pound of dry matter in, not how much can we feed her and how much can we get out on the other end. All of those things are the actual transition. The practical transition is much easier when you understand those things, which is why, again, if we didn't learn holistic management, this would not have coalesced in our brain fast enough and well enough to understand how all of those complex systems fit together and lend themselves to a profitable system in your place, given your your set of tools, whether
That's
the
right.
people and things and finances and what have you got to work with, how are you going to wield that into a profitable system? And there are these inherent truths, right, around the way nature works. That's what is the real transition. And then you're much less concerned with the yield drop, because honestly, it's irrelevant.
Mm, that's amazing. Phyllis, you had mentioned it's important for folks to understand forages and their role in nutrition. Can you speak more to that?
Yeah, I think so. I'll just get out of the way. Probably in general, you could say that beef producers understand this a little bit better. Maybe that depends on how much, if and how much grain they feed. But as Paul said, there you can make a lot of milk with grain, and there's a lot of forgiveness in grain. The other thing about buying grain is you're also buying a mineral pack, right? So you're buying energy and you're buying minerals. So there's this assumption that the forages that you graze are just sort of, they are what they are, right? And then we can just make it up with a grain scoop. And you say, well, okay, we're gonna stop feeding grain. It's really important to understand the magnitude of the task to replace that grain with a forage, because forages are very, very reactive to their soil health. So you can walk from one spot on your farm where the soil health is high and look at that set of diverse species, or not so, or whatever's growing there, and then move to a more remote area where the soil is, maybe more played out. same set of plants, and where you'll have nice, soft, dark green leaves on your orchard grass behind the barn, you'll have a stalk with pitiful leaves already headed out. The weather's the same. I mean, I only walk a few hundred yards, right?
Mhm.
It's not weather related, same rain, same whatever. It's a stressed plant, sending up a seed head early. The difference in the digestibility and the potential to keep a dairy cow that works very hard, healthy and productive, there's the difference right there. And I don't think that people really understand that, you know, the the plant will respond to soil health in ways that either lends it to be more digestible, to Paul's part,
Right.
or not. And
Right. To not get too deep in the weeds, I would say that people starting out that want to understand that, then they would want to essentially um, read and interact with anyone they can who can explain lignin and digestibility, and then get there's lots of information from, and I'm not necessarily a proponent of all the land grants, but get the best information you can on forage, and then read it all, and then forget it all, and then learn to understand the difference between your tests on your best soils and your worst soils, and do a little testing there and look at how those feeds are growing and testing and feeding. So recently, I had a young man that sent me 4 forage tests, and he said, I'm going to buy some feed from New York. He's in Pennsylvania. Tell me which one to buy."
I
And
got 4 lots
and
to
I got
choose
4
from
lots to choose from, and he had 4 tests. And I said, "I want you to buy a little bit out of all 4 lots
on your first
on
load.
your first load, and I want you to stick them in front of cows, because the forage test is not the whole story. And the college will tell you it is. The scientists will tell you that it is. It's not. And so we this is another one of those areas of science where we know as humans just enough to be dangerous, but we have to work with what we know. So I'm not saying we shouldn't get forages tested and we shouldn't continue to try to learn. Um, but it's like our understanding of sequestering carbon. It's in its infant stages, and you know, uh, we have been carbon testing the farm, and we've been watching what happens as we graze and or cut it for hay and or do other activities. So it's um, all of this stuff is not. There is no silver bullet. You're not going to get a very clear, definitive answer from any of it. What you're going to get is hints, and you're going to learn to sneak up on things that actually work.
Mhm.
And that's I know that's not very gratifying to someone who's laying it all on the line in a transition, but um, that's a big part of it, which is trying to keep up. And then the other piece that's broadly missing and has to be sort of congratulated is farmers that are that have strong observational skills. I tell trust your gut, get out there and walk around in the pasture, and Joel Salton's right about this one. Don't drive the quad through the pasture. Get off the quad, walk around in the pasture, and sit down, spend a little time there, listen, watch the cows graze, look at your plant spacing, look at the activity around the manure pats. Learn to understand that ecosystem and what impacts it and improves it. One of the cool things about bale grazing through the years is we came to this in our area. We set the bales 50, 60 feet apart, and that's because 2 years later, those green spots that are created by the bale grazing have grown to each other, and
Mm.
now all the grass looks healthy and productive. And that's obviously the microbiology, but it took us. That was just one of those epiphanies by literally just getting out there and looking. And now it's we get that question almost every time when we talk about bale grazing, and it's not. That didn't come out of some like
huge data set at a university that came out with Paul and Phyllis going, huh, look at that, will you?
In
No, and
go ahead, Phyllis.
well, to bring it, and once you start to get your head wrapped around the ecosystem process, right? You learn holistic management. You're like, obviously minerals are cycling here, and that's very important in forage quality. But the energy that's required, and I think as dairy farmers, we're acutely aware of energy requirements, especially in 100% grass fed. The energy requirements are high in our dairy cows, and if you look at rumen function, you understand that a healthy cell wall, an unstressed, lignin actually um, binds up and makes unavailable the rest of the cell wall, the cellulose portion of the cell wall. And you can actually be in an energy deficit if your forage qualities are too poor. And I don't think um, that people really get that, because if you've got any other lever that you can dump into the system and make up for that energy, you don't need to learn it, right? And
That's where grain comes in. That's why, poor pasture management works with grain,
Mm.
and low fertility pastures work with grain because it's just filler. And this frustrates people new to this because they think, well, I've got the pasture all split up. I'm opening and closing the gates. I'm moving the cattle when you tell me to, and
and
they
I'm getting a good trample, and they start, I'm
right.
just going to jump in, because one of the things that we are frustrated with, and maybe because we saw it in ourselves as we worked through the process, and I really mean it, it's years to really get your mind around. Don't stop when and you're like, yeah, context. No, you need to really understand what a context is. Like, dive deep into that. That's not just like, I want to write down my ideal existence. It is, but it's much more than that, right? What you know push all the way through, so that you really wrap your mind around how these processes work, because it's the only thing that's going to bring you full circle
Mhm.
to I don't know where
In
I
ter-
start.
Yeah. Well, I think you're getting at some of the mindset shifts that are necessary to be successful. And I'm thinking back to the case study that you guys put out a number of years ago titled Less Stress, More Grass. And I'll link that in the show notes for folks that are interested in reading that, because I think it's a wealth of information and you guys get really detailed on a lot of the specifics. There was one piece in there where you mentioned that you had to shift your focus from grass utilization to forage recovery. Tell me about that shift in perspective and why that matters.
The untoward acceleration.
Okay. Yep, there it is.
So there's this sort of counterintuitive aspect of planned grazing that was a bit of a leap of faith for me. And I got very good at knowing how much dry matter was standing, and that I could capture with a poly wire for my cow's ration. Um, and I would literally, I'd milk the cows. He was always out making feed. And I'd milk the cows, and then I'd go out and I'd gather up the poly wire from the previous grazing, every 12 hours, a new spot. And then I'd take a look at what grass was there, and I'd pace out another area to last them till the next milking. And I could decide if I wanted to take half, leave half of whatever random species I was looking at. I
Mhm.
will note, which should not be, by the way. And then, and I would keep doing that. And without fail, I was out of grass in July, not, struggling for maybe another 30 days. And pretty much we went on full feed by mid-August, which is not a very financially viable system. And because what that does is it's
it's managing. If you translate it directly into holistic management, overgrazing is a factor of time and not numbers. That also means it's not a function of dry matter. That's what that means. Cow numbers equals dry matter. How many cows you have and how much they eat is
Hmm.
how much dry matter is there. So that the amount of dry matter that's in your pasture doesn't matter. And you have to see people's heads spin in these grazing seminars that I do when I say, okay, so we're gonna do your relative quality and we're gonna estimate and so what do you have any idea how many days they grazed last year or how many bales would you get off of it? And they're and they get all stressed out like they need to get that number right. I need to know what the dry matter is so that I can manage this grazing. And then I go, honestly, just guess. It doesn't really matter. And they're like, what? And I go, "It's completely irrelevant." I'm like, "Well, and sometimes I can bring them around because I go, well, it's if it rains one year and doesn't rain another year, doesn't that swing like by a lot?" And they're like, "Well, yeah." I'm like, "Well, then it doesn't matter. You have no idea what's going to grow in your pasture, do you?"
Hmm.
I go, "No." And I say, "Well, that's because it doesn't matter. You're going to manage it anyway. What you're going to manage is the placement of your herd in a way that's going to increase your forage." Next time around, time after that. And, the first time I heard about planned grazing and, the guy's talking about, so you go around and it's this tall the first time and then you come back and it's this tall and then and I'm like, no, no, no. It's this tall. And you come back and it's this tall. And then you come back tall.
It's working in the opposite direction.
And yeah, so that was the one that we were going broke, right?
Hmm.
Running out of grass. So once you really So for me, it was that leap of faith. I'm like, okay, I get it. I understand the recovery piece, which is the first basic piece you need to get your head wrapped around in order to learn to graze. There are people who think that's the only piece. It's not by a long shot, right? Time, timing, behavior. Those are
Hmm.
very, very important things. And the time one, that's like, well, it's actually, I would say maybe timing, right? Your recovery. And um, just a sort of a leap of faith. So one of the aces in the hole that dairy farmers have, and poor grazers, anybody who's a poor grazer, if you're doing a crappy job grazing and you're not getting very much of your total annual production directly from pasture, unless your cows are dying, you have enough feed to feed them the rest of it. You got only one way to go. So anything that you do better, don't worry about it. If you don't have enough, if because you have to be in this pasture now for a week instead of 3 days, right? The dry matter would say you've got 3 days worth of dry matter. The recovery says you gotta be here for a week. What are you gonna do for those other 4 days? Well, you're already bad at it and you got hay, so feed them hay, you know? That's really and dairy farmers definitely have the feed. I'm not saying it's the only way to move through this, but being a grass-fed dairy farmer, we don't really we can't buy and sell cows. We can't go, we need to stock, destock. There are I think we've got I don't know how many farmers we could sell probably 250 grass-fed cows right now into the market if
Right. A
we
variable stocking rate's not part of what we do, and it fits in perfect. So I'm going to sort of what you send out there as a herd to utilize the better management is a source of profit, right? If you're sending out a bunch of giant, high production conventional cows that are going to lay down under the tree when it gets hot, the best management's not going to work. But if you've got this sort of really spicy group of crossbreds that are highly efficient converters of that pasture into milk, and with a body weight of 1,100 pounds, just kind of cows that they just go out and get the job done and breed back and moderate energy requirements and very low maintenance requirements when couched against their actual production. That's a huge source of profit that grass-fed guys have to be building towards. So they can't buy and sell cows because there are no great, like grass-fed cattle are highly sought after. The genetics are poorly understood. And so, yeah, I just sort of throw that in at that point. And that is like understanding that. I mean, there was a time when we had a whole bunch of very large cows, and we got to a point when we went grass fed where we sold those large cows and kept all the scrappy little cows that I'm talking about. And what happened was our feed production went, or the amount of feed we were feeding went down over 40%, but the milk only went down 20%. And we figured out very quickly that we were feeding and maintaining a lot of cow pounds that were not productive. So
and it was about 30% of the herd,
right,
in numbers, in cow numbers.
Right. We watched those numbers through the years and have done a lot of back of the napkin type of math on that stuff. So, and some of the early minds, the bondsman work that Gerald and Beatsman and others have put on paper and books, that at 900 to 1100 pound cow is the most efficient for a grass system. So, you get to a 1400 pound cow, she's typically going to be 20% less efficient than a 1,000 pound cow. About 5% less efficient for every 100 pounds of body weight you go up from 1,000. And so, when I say that, I'm not saying everybody has to milk a 1,000 pound cow. What I'm saying is that based on your soil fertility, the condition of the farm, and
your context,
and your context, and the quality of the grass, and all these other questions, it is a known fact that a larger cow, while highly associated with milk production, you're moving towards a cow that will. I always say, if you've got 1,800 pound Holsteins, then they ought to come with a grain scoop necklace around their neck, because they're not going to be they're not going to be a grass-fed cow, guys.
Yeah. So it folds back into the behavior piece in one,
Right.
and it folds into your whole under management, right? What have you got to work with? And if you've got grain to work with, then you can bump up to a little bit slightly larger cow if you like. If you've got
Right.
decent soil health and decent forage quality, you can start to select within your herd for more milk production, because you can support that cow in that higher paying job that she's got. So, the defining your whole under management and all of the pieces that you have that feed into your context, it's very important to understand that, because that's how you wield all this complexity. And the behavior piece should not be lost, right? You need a cow that's going to be somewhat aggressive, and you can do other things to even manipulate the behavior of the cows that you have. If there really isn't much out there in your pasture right now, you've decided on your recovery periods or whatever. Now you have to decide your impact. Dairy cows are a lot hungrier than beef cows, so you can turn them out first and get a very different impact than if you feed them some nice, soft, second cut dry hay as you're finishing up milking, and then you set them out. If you want a heavy impact, you can affect that. If you want a lighter impact, you can affect that. It's, it's just, for me, it's endlessly fascinating to wield that that's how the cows fit in the pasture management, in the chain of production. They're that product conversion piece. So the resources that you have, so their health, their body size, their all of that feeds in to understanding, and that brings you back down to a very basic profitability level.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we've done in the last few years is push milking times around to sort of take advantage of the crepuscular nature of bovines, just to have them out at the 2 times a day that they want to be out hammering the grass.
They're most excited.
And and then you watch the bird life activity around them when they're there, when they're sort of in quotes supposed to be there. And then you start to you get the fun thing of this sort of thing of thinking about how much of this system do we not see and understand yet? Like, I mean, it's like, okay, well, there's cattle, we're driving along the road, or we're sitting next to the fence and we're watching 200 dairy cows graze and the birds are flying around. But what else is going on? Well, obviously, I mean, in the last few years in the regenerative space, we've learned that there is so much going on right there. And the fascination of all that. And I would still say, it's that, I don't know whose book. Oh, I think it was Gerald Fry's book, actually, where he has the circle and there's the tiny little slice of like 3%. And he said, this is the part we understand. And then there's the 97%. He's like, this is the part we don't understand yet. And I always love that because the amount of humility and sort of grace in that. And, from as a person of faith, I really find that very comforting that we don't have to understand it all. We just have to witness it and
Mhm.
be good um, managers and stewards of it.
Yeah. Well, in terms of the aspects that perhaps you weren't intentionally managing for, so you're managing for profitability and production and healthy pastures, but you were just mentioning birds flying around. And wasn't there a study that was done on your farm about bird populations?
Yep.
Yes. Yeah. Ground nesting birds in our region. What is the
It was
species?
4. Well, there's bobolinks I know are
Yeah,
one,
bobolink.
but there were several. The only ground nesting bird that we had less of than everybody else were killdeer because they like open open
Bears,
open
bears.
to the soil.
But aside from that, what were the main takeaways of the study for folks that haven't
But
read it? And again, I'll put the link to the study in the show notes for folks. But what's the main takeaway?
Main takeaway was we had just 4 times the number of population of those species that are considered foundational species because to the healthy bird populations in New York State. And frankly, it's just that we cut so much of the state to hay and grow so much corn that their ecosystem through the years has disappeared. The bobolinks, especially, their population collapsed, and now through good pasture management, I mean, it
so
was
they
remarkable because I mean, I'm in my early 60s, and they disappeared when I was a little kid, you know.
Mm,
So, and I grew up rural, so we always kind of knew like where did that bird go, you
and so
know?
the hay
And
ground the hay ground pushed them out, right? But this study was on pasture, so they were relegated to only trying to survive in pasture systems. And this study looked at um, set stock, conventional, simple rotational,
right,
and holistic planned grazing farms. And the obviously the set stock farms, there were very few ground nesting birds. So, without the pasture management and without holistic management, then they couldn't even survive there. So
yeah. I
yeah.
think we've talked around it a little bit, but could you address it straight on? What is the difference between a standard rotational grazing regime and holistic planned grazing? For listeners that perhaps might be newer to this space, can you just clarify what the difference between those are?
Yeah, I think for me, I would say the difference is if you stop at either not even understanding recovery periods or even if you just stop at the recovery piece, you're pretty much stuck in rotational grazing. And even if you're sort of trying to manage a little bit of your pasture health with just maintaining adequate recovery periods, um, that's very, very different than holistic planned grazing. And really, rotational grazing is okay. So you don't have just one big pasture that you let them roam around in endlessly without any constraints. Rotational grazing is I break it up into different cells or paddocks and I move them around. But it's still usually tied to dry matter consumption. So they, as soon as they've finished the feed in whatever area they're in, they move them to the next one. And, it doesn't really address.
any of the, you know, the fabulous things that can come with grazing, which is increasing plant diversity, which funnels right up into cow performance. So you're going to get better health, better pregnancies, better rates of gain, more milk. All of those things happen when your forage diversity and health increases. And if you can't manage your grazing in a way that increases biodiversity and plant health and soil health, then you got a lot to learn. You should go back to the drawing board. And it's more than just moving them around and not being free range.
One of the things that I think more accomplished farmers helps them actually understand this, in my experience, is when you get to the point where you're talking about not reseeding pastures, not plowing pastures any longer, because you show them photos of swards that represent the entire population curve of the plants. And so, and then you'd say, you're looking out at that, and there's some dried seed heads above the green, and you say, that's less, that might be 10 to 15% of those heads still standing there or whatever. And then you say, when those are dried, and then you send those cattle through for the second, third, fourth, fifth, eighth, 10th graze, whatever, they're pushing those down, and if there's any soil available for those seed heads, you're reseeding your pasture as you're grazing. That's a eye opener for some. Like, a lot of farmers are like, wait a minute, are you telling me this system will perpetually do this if I manage it well? Yes, that's exactly what we're saying. And then, that gives them not only something that makes sense to them financially, but it gives them a tremendous upside to the additional brain power management that you're asking them to do, right? Because I mean, I warn people that are HM junkies to not sort of oversell this, in the sense that you show up on someone's farm and you tell them, well, I want you to read the 3 books, and I want you to read them again, and then I want to.
He means all 3 editions.
And then go, and we're going to do.
I haven't even done that.
Well, sorry.
All you need is the 3rd edition. The 3rd edition is much shorter than the 1st and the 2nd, and so you just need one of them.
Yeah. Well, so we wanted to understand. Actually, I learned holistic management in the 90s, but with obviously the 1st edition. But Phyllis and I both decided, and I don't forget when it was, we wanted to understand his process through the 3 books a little more intensely. And there is some things that get peeled off that I feel are super high quality information, and not to put too fine a point on it, but when life gives you the gift of working with a genius, you should take that to its final conclusion. And he is a genius. There's no doubt in my mind that he is. And I've spent time with not only Alan, but other geniuses. And when you see how their brains work, you're like, oh, you know what? This is a book unto itself. How this guy actually thinks through these things, and allows information to percolate through that is uniquely different, maybe, than the rest of us in how we interact with information. But so I just tell people that, selling them on a high intense management job is not like, these are super hardworking, overwhelmed people. That can't be the story. The story has to be that we're going to take you to a place where your management is actually going to eliminate a lot of the difficult and tough things that you have to do now.
Right.
And by learning the ecosystem processes, and frankly, and how this grazing will change your system. And I resisted that tremendously personally at the beginning, Bobby. I mean, I fought back, and even Phyllis and I, we had to bounce these ideas off, and really we had a lot of very lively conversations around it, because it's like, I would say things to her like, that can't work. There's no way that's going to work based on what I've seen. And of course, I'm
doing it anyway. I think it will.
Based on what I've seen, right? So, I mean, the idea that the future is going to be only based on the information that we have today and what we've seen is part of the problem, because you're asking somebody there is a very, very important leap of faith part of this
Mhm.
that I think we have to do a better job of selling the upside of that leap of
Yeah.
Mhm.
faith.
For folks that are considering making the transition into, whether it's the transition from organic to grass fed or from rotational grazing to holistic planned grazing, what are some things that they might not be realizing in making these transitions? Like, what word of advice would you provide to folks who are wanting to do this? They see the potential upside. They're nervous about losing some of the safety nets and things that they've been doing for so long. Like, what advice do you
Well,
think is most important for folks to hear?
I would say um, that you can make a lot of these changes before you make the change. And what I mean by that is, so you have your eye on the idea of being grass fed, organic, regenerative, and you're a conventional grazer shipping conventional milk now. Um, there's things you can do before you go whole hog and change your market and take all of the risk. There's things you can do to begin to understand some of the changes that you're going to have to make by doing it. Raise, if you're raising 20 heifers a year, raise two of them with milk and grass only and see how that goes. Dip your toe. I guess my advice is dip your toe in, um, and then the same with grazing. Start to manage the farm based on recovery rather than just dry matter. Um, and then after you begin to do that, look at the rest of the principles and go visit. I also tell this to farmers all the time. Go visit 4 or 5 producers that you have respect for and are doing quite well in the type of farming that you want to move towards, and pick their brain, um, and spend some time with them as much as they'll allow, um, and sort of like get that beginning to happen in your mind, and through the years, um, as I talk to farmers all the time, I that seems to be um, a really safe way for farmers to move and make changes is when they go and they actually see it working somewhere. It's like, okay, this is not just some consultant standing at a podium with a PowerPoint. This is actually happening. And one of the really great things is oftentimes the farmers don't even know why it's happening. They can't articulate why it's working, but they kind of know in a rudimentary fashion how they got where they got to. And so when it's described from that standpoint, which is frankly how that's my, if I have a place in this movement, that's my place. I get to stand with a bunch of young farmers and say, look, I'm not going to tell you what all the science around it because I don't know it and I don't need to know it. What I'm telling you is this is how I plop these bales out here. This is how we graze. This is the kind of cow I pick. And now here's my numbers. Here's how this is working. And so when they, I would that would be my advice. Get out there, visit those farms, and then start to make the changes while your system is still, in theory, working the way you want it to be. The other thing, though, is I've oftentimes don't wait till your system is truly upside down and not working to make changes. Make changes when you have some
Just
financial
make changes now.
make changes quickly while you have some flow.
Just do it now. I would
Like while you still have some grease to make things work, because you don't want to be it- making the changes when you have zero um, financial resource is kind of pressure that nobody needs.
Yeah, I 100% agree, and I'll add, read the book and read the book over again so that you can start to bring some one of the things that's very difficult, especially
The reason people don't change is they already have too much on their mind. And if you don't give yourself a tool to help you organize those thoughts and let you know that you're on a path that, if you got to walk through a valley, at least if you know you're walking in the right direction and you're going to get through to the other side, you can do it, right? A lot of it is the unknown. And that, holistic management really, if you put the effort in, it will help you understand what is going on. And I would say absolutely use a grazing plan. I firmly believe that starting with grazing, even if you're using it as a record, which frankly most grazing consultants will have you use a grazing plan, which is just a record of what you've done. And to me, if that's your first step, that's fine. Do it that way. And if your next step is just using it to flex those recovery periods, that's fine. Do it that way. But every year you will be able to track. You're going to be able to go back, and the way I do it is I use the relative quality as the actual animal days, and then I translate that into the animal days per acre, and I can track whether I'm going up or down. Always go up, even
Hmm.
from year 1 to year 2. Those numbers went up, and it's very informative and it's very heartening. And again, for us as grass-fed dairy farmers, it's very straightforward. If we go out and make balage and feed our cows 365 days a year, it's going to cost us X. X minus the number of days that we have on pasture. That's huge in our bottom line, right? Our feed costs. So as Paul talked about before, we feed for, if we pasture for an extra 20 days at $500 a day, that's not just money that is, it's not even gonna go to your bottom line. It's gonna go to the places that you really need to be spending money on, and then you can compound it from there, right? Now you're fixing your next problem. Then you take that set of resources and you fix your next problem. You alleviate your shortcomings in your equipment, right? You really needed fill in the blank. Now you can purchase that. You're relieving your labor burden and all these other things. And it costs 0 money practically to change your grazing management. So talk to people that are doing it,
Yeah.
go and see them, read about the processes that work. That book is
Hmm.
the place. And just go, just do it.
Yeah.
Be so happy.
We've talked a lot about the transition into holistic management and planned grazing, but you guys have been at this for quite some time now. So, you know, even though you're first generation farmers, you've got quite a lot of experience under your belt, which is wonderful to be able to speak to all these different scenarios that folks might find themselves in. And I'm curious more on what are some of the long-term things that maybe took some time to show up in your land or in your animals? Like, what were some of the slower things to respond, or even some of the lessons that took you quite a long time to learn that you didn't quite get in the early days?
I mean, I can sort of talk to that question in regards to the farms, and then I'll let Billy take a stab at it. But um, in the first farm, you don't know what you don't know. So I was talking to a lot of organic farmers and bringing sort of a lot of basic organic principles to it. And we were not impacting the fertility um, very quickly at all. Um, and, the first farm, I say what took us 7 years has taken us about half the time on the second farm that we bought in 17. And different soil types, so even maybe more stubborn than the first farm, but as far as an uphill battle. But the point I'm making is when you have the context sort of, and I'm not going to say we have it perfectly aligned. We don't. We're still changing and learning. What I'm saying is we were closer the second time. We came into it knowing what we should be worried about and kind of where to start. So we were more effective, and so that can be applied 1,000 times, right? Because you got all your hay fields, maybe a section of pasture that you've been cropping and now you're going to turn into like every time you get a chance to redo that set of sort of question in regard to land management, you bring that new set of skills based on your experience and what you've seen happen. And so it very much compounds on itself in that regard. So I would say, you know, um, I don't think 5 years is an unreasonable amount of time to awaken a farm we bought two farms. One was settled in 1780. The other was settled in 1752.
Wow.
So, we bought one in 2006 and we bought one in 2017. We farmed before that on another farm, but these two farms are where we're dairying now. And when I think about these two farms, I think the amount of resource management that took place here, that went much of it going in the wrong direction because this land loves to be plowed. Um, it's hard to like, it's hard to gripe about it taking 5 to 7 years. I mean, it's like that is like unbelievably fast and amazing from a natural system standpoint. So I think land turns around fast when you show up with the right attitude
And a lot of cows.
and a lot of cows, right? Over, yeah, good point.
Don't believe in the myth of overstock.
Right, overstock. But absolutely, we overstocked, and we caught a lot of criticism for it. But it was one of the things that really helped us work ourselves around. Also, I would, a little bit of caution. When you overstock in the northern climates, you got to remember that you got to feed them through the winter too. So you better have your checkbook ready on that side.
And that can also be an asset, though.
Absolutely,
you can
because
turn
you're
that into
bringing in that fertility to your farming system, and you're feeding it out on land that is hungry for nutrition and carbon.
And life isn't math. You're not subtracting from somewhere else and just adding it to your farm. What you do is you increase your ability. You bring in 2x and your production goes up 4x, and now you've got 2x that if you want to, you can haul back to that other place and make that 4x. I mean, it just, life by definition proliferates. So don't believe in the myth of too many cattle. I got to tell them about when I was in Zimbabwe and of talking to Alan.
Yeah, please do. I was actually noticing, Paul, you're wearing a hat from the Africa Center for Holistic Management. So I was going to ask, have you guys been to Zim? For folks that aren't paying attention, the Africa Center is Alan's home in Zimbabwe. It's the first savory hub. And a lot of people go there to just witness it in person because this is one of the longest running holistically managed properties that are out there. And it's just incredible. So yeah, Phyllis, please go ahead. What was it like going and seeing it?
Life, and I have to get him there. I will get him there. I went in 2014, and we also when we had a central savory conference. We were in London that year too. That was, oh my gosh, what a amazing. So, but pretty new, right? I was like, what was I? Maybe 2 years in, 18 months in. I had read the two editions. Trying to noodle into Alan's brain as much as I could. And anyway, he was talking about a bunch of stuff, and somehow it led me to ask the question, well, have you ever been anywhere where they were overstocked? And he thought, nope. And he left it like that. And I was like, and here I am inside going, well, what does that mean? What are you talking about? Which you just don't do. You go, okay, I got a lot of noodling to do on this. I got to, that's heavy. Have you ever, this is a man who's been how many places over how long over the entire globe? And I asked him if he's ever been anywhere that was overstocked. And he says, no. I'm like, and I got to tell you, it was revolutionary. I mean, it took me a very, very long time. I'll cut to the end. I mean,
yeah, what'd you learn?
pretty much where, and he'll have to tell you if where I landed was at all appropriate, but unless your cows are dead, it's a management issue, which you could loosely say is a logistics constraint. That's valid, right? So if I'm bringing, if I don't have enough pasture, right? If my management in my pasture, or if I have too many cows, if I truly do have too many cows for the area that I'm constraining by pasture, then I have to bring them in feed. You could deduce that if I could bring the cows over to where I got the feed, right? It's a different management. I'm harvesting the feed and bringing it to them rather than having them. So it really is a matter of logistics and management. So it's up to you to manage your way back out of that. And so it drove me to really have faith in the idea that grass doesn't grow cows, cows grow grass.
Mm.
It actually works the other way around. So, you know, you can have, because we watched it
Very
on our
fun to
pasture.
watch her say that to farmers, by the way. Very fun.
Yeah,
Because their brains just break.
they break. And here's another one. I love it when because I was here too. I'm like, oh, I'm doing, this is going so well. And then you see your cow reaching through the fence, right? And you got to ask yourself, okay, so I'm saying out of my face that I believe that cows and grasslands co-evolved, benefit each other, symbiotic, right? Which would lead you, logically, where the cows are, the grass is better. If your cow's reaching through the fence, you're doing something wrong. Why is the forage better where the cows aren't? The grass should always be better where the cows are, and they shouldn't want to leave the fence. That one also, they're just like, because they're all worried about when you're when you propose this grazing. Well, how am I going to keep them in? And do I need electric fences? And do I need this? Your cows should be where the grass is the best and not want to go everywhere else. And that does not mean that all you have to do is snap your fingers and start managing correctly. It's going to take you 5 years to get there, but you should be getting there. So it's all just a matter of management, really, when it comes down to it. And that, for me, that was very empowering, because it was a challenge that I just was really glad to take.
I just another observation, Bobby, too, that I think is important is one of the gifts of our work is we get to travel and see other farms, and there is a group of grass-fed dairy people that are understand this exceedingly well now,
Yeah.
and that was not true in 2010. And those farms, not only are they getting amazing results, very healthy cows, good productivity, which all of them say, I think we're just scratching the surface. But their financial outcomes are much higher than sort of the group as a whole.
And they're so happy.
Right.
They're just
And
so
so
happy people.
It's for us, the work is obvious. It's basically, look, we've got this, this 15% of these farmers that are doing very well. We just got to get these other 85% to really understand these principles and see what the way forward is. And
regardless of the production model.
Exactly. And because it could be beef, it could be it could be crops, it could be a lot of things. It doesn't have to be chicken milk. But yeah, so you sort of see that, and the work becomes sort of plain and obvious and inspirational, really. I mean, when you see how profound it is for the farms that are doing well, and that the fact that their children are now in many cases involved or taking the farms over, it's like that's been a big problem for a long time, is to get somebody that wants to, we say at dairy is getting the second generation to fall on the sword of dairy has not been so easy, right? Well, of course, because that's what we're asking. But if we can show them a lifestyle that's amazing, and a kind of farming that's fun to be part of, then we don't have to do very much to get them to stay. They're going to want to stay. And so that's been a huge eye opener for us to see that sort of spreading around the better producers, more productive farms that understand a lot of it.
Yeah, it seems like the tides are changing. Like you said, just since 2010, so much has changed. And um, I know we're coming up on 2 hours of recording here. We've turned this into a long form podcast, which I'm fine with, but I want to be respectful of you guys' time because I know you've got cows out there that need some care and attention. But I'm wondering where you see things headed into the future for the dairy industry on the whole, or even maybe more broadly speaking, in regenerative agriculture. Like, what sort of trends have you seen in the last decade or so? And then where do you think everything is going?
I mean, your question really leads to broader cultural questions and think impacts from outside of agriculture. I have a very sort of optimistic uh, point to make that um, cultures are often changed by changes in food and agriculture. I believe that we are in the middle of one of those changes right now. I think people are thinking about not being in pain and wanting to feel healthier and wanting to see people that they live around, their neighbors primarily, live happier and more productive lives, um, and not being sort of yanked around by a very sort of politicized, sort of negative sort of view of the world. And I think right now, food and farming is in a place where we can have a very productive part in that healthy transition a kinder, saner, more productive world. We can all we can all argue about the details of what has to get fixed in order for that to happen. Um, and I would say one of the conversations that you can't skip is how do we fix money? Because money it really is so central to so many things that everyone does that if we don't have a fair money system, it's very difficult to talk about fixing any of the other issues at hand. And so, yeah, I think um, the regenerative movement, um, I would say, needs to continue to be all steak and less sizzle. In other words, more content that gets to the issues at hand. And I think we need to worry less about signing NDAs. I think we need to all run around for, like Phyllis and I have done for the last 20 years and literally try to give away everything that we have learned and not, it doesn't have to make money. We need to figure out a way for it to actually get into people's heads. And and we might have to do extraordinary things for that to happen. But
Because it really is the basis for the profitability of so many people who are trying to take back control of producing food
right,
and making that distance between the people who are being empowered by taking control of the food that they eat. There's, people are trying
that's
to
right.
they're empowered by taking control of their own nourishment, and they know that there are people that are trying to take control of nourishing people, and the distance between the two is short, and it has to be in order to fix the
Yes.
money around it, right? It's so circuitous that too much gets lost along the way. So I think both of us are very hopeful that more people will bring themselves into agriculture, including in dairy. I mean, I think that raw milk is going to
Right.
gain in popularity.
It
I
is
think
gaining. Yeah.
smaller producers, which, you know, there were we just came out of a period where there were no startups. There was no ability to lend to borrow money to start up. There were no markets that were willing to take you on. The freight was too expensive, but the growth in the sector, even the commodities, I mean, we sort of consider grass-fed a commodity at this point, unless it's raw farm to consumer, it's going through that chain, and even that is pulling small producers in again because the growth, no grass-fed milk on the shelves, and, people can't keep up with it. The demand,
Right.
right? The
Exactly.
markets are having trouble keeping up with the demand of people who want their milk to come from people that are actually invested in a production model that is truly nourishing and beneficial for everything involved. And that doesn't happen in that linear biggering model that really doesn't have an end. So for the first time over the last, it's only been about a year or so, we're seeing more
Yeah.
smaller producers able to start up, which is really, really exciting because, you know, that article that Paul wrote in 2010 that talked about that that separation between, all the milk that people drink will be grass-fed, and then the other milk will do all the other things that milk does in the industry, right?
Mhm.
Right down to medical, medical parts from the cull cows.
Mhm.
But really, the people, the actual dairy products that people bring onto their table will come from small farmers. That's what I think.
Yeah, and that understanding how that productive ecology works is the key to this revolution. I
Yeah.
mean, and it is. It's um,
And it will,
I'm willing to have the scaling
yes,
conversation and all the conversations around it.
because I think it will
And
scale.
yeah, and we're seeing more and more farmers say, okay, well, how do we do this, with custom help from the machine side, and like, it's um I don't I think it's time to have those conversations and look at it really from the eyes of somebody that is coming in from a more conventional mindset, and then working out pieces and parts of it. And you know we have science. I mean, there's a lot of science to support this type of farming now. It's not, you know 20 years ago when we started, it looked ridiculous to people. Why would you take good hay bales and put them out on a pasture
Why
like
are
this?
you
What are
grazing
you
our best
doing?
hay field?
Right. Why are you grazing our best hay fields? That was the farmer that we bought the farm from. What are you doing? You can't put cows over there. What are you doing? So, um, and then also what fertilizer does to soils and productivity and short term, long term, and our understanding of all around that has matured, come a long way. These agriculture was walking around on a set of stilts, right? And it still is in many respects. And until we get it off the stilts and we get our feet on the ground and it's sort of a more resilient mindset. And even the huge conventional farms are coming to this. They're coming to it because the dollar they're receiving for the commodity they're producing is no longer working.
Mhm.
And so, you don't have to read those numbers very long and
Mhm.
see the kind of depreciation numbers that you're managing and how there's no way out for them. Um, and it's happening in beef. We're at a 50 or 75-year low in the country's beef production, and that's because a lot of guys my age look at these cow prices and land prices and say, "Why am I going to continue to whip myself and my family to produce a commodity that just frankly doesn't pencil out?" And yes, their production model. We can sit here and sort of make that judgment that their production model is off. But it is also a reality that that dollar did work for their production model at one point and longer works. So, there's really the rub, right? How are we to react to that? I think there's two things that have to happen. We have to change our mindset between our ears, as Tim always says. And as a culture, we do have to fix money. We have to figure out a way so that people that labor at the end of 40 years their only answer can't be to sell the resources that they've managed. That can't be the only answer. They have to have, the farmer has the farm as a retirement. And when you begin to understand the importance of multi-generational farming and fertility and how it actually works, you realize what a tragedy that is. That every 40 years, we're going to sell that piece of property off to a different use or to a different family. We're never going to get anywhere as a culture. That's just,
Yeah. Well, there's a piece of it that's lost every time it changes hands. There's some of it that gets siphoned off either through inheritance tax, or a piece of it goes into development. Bit by bit, we're slowly just siphoning off all of our productive working land. And anything that we can do to reverse that, I think, is absolutely needed.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Bobby,
Well,
fun.
this has been uh, so enlightening and insightful to dive deep. I actually have like 100 more questions that I wanted to ask you about, like mineralization of forage and how you got your mastitis to drop from 73 to 3%, and getting into the specifics of your grazing plan and H5N1, and like there's so many things that I wanted to talk about. So maybe we do a round two at
Yeah,
some point.
suggest let's do a round two, and then you're an editor. You can go from there.
Awesome. Well, for folks that want to follow along with your journey, where is best to point our audience to? Where can they find you in the
We're not-
digital world?
Yeah, we don't even have a website.
We're like in-person people.
Yeah, so
I think we do still have a
We got to find them. We got to go find them.
yeah, I mean, we're highly Googleable, but I would say our email is dharmali@gmail.com, and that I'm happy to have that out there. And if people want to ask us questions, that's a great way to reach us. And so that's DHARNALEA and yeah, especially farmers, I would say, but people that drink grass-fed milk too, if they have any questions about how it actually happens, we're happy to talk about it. And anything to do with our understanding of holistic management, if that's where people are at, I would love to delve into that too. Yeah.
Which is kind of required. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but you can't just read the book. You got to talk to people about it.
There's a lot of people that will try to just read the book and do it on their own, and you can only get so far without that in-person experience and the mentorship and that peer-to-peer learning. It's so invaluable.
It is. It is.
Great.
Yeah. Well, thankfully, there are folks like you who have paved the way for others, showing how it's done and making those transitions and doing it in a way that is profitable, good for your pastures, common sense, and at the end of the day, gets us the healthiest, most nutrient dense product that we need. So, thanks for paving the way for everyone and leading by example.
Great talking to you,
guys.
Bobby. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, guys. Have a good one. This episode was edited by Claire Everson, and her theme music was composed and performed by Travis McNamara. Ruminations is a production of the Savory Institute, the Savory Foundation, and Land to Market. If you like this episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast and subscribing to our YouTube channel, where you can find video versions of all episodes, plus other content. If you're looking for show notes, links to things mentioned in the episode, transcripts, sponsorship info, or if you'd like to even suggest a guest to come on the show, all of that can be found on our website at savory.global/podcast. And last but certainly not least, thank you to our committed and growing community of regenerating members whose monthly support allows Savory to produce this podcast and continue advancing holistic management all across the globe. If you're not yet a member, we welcome you to join us with open arms, and we would love to have you as part of our community. Just sign up at savory.global/member. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.